Great. Okay, so does this mean we're live? I need a thumbs up.
Yes.
We're live. Okay, well, for those of you who are here already, I'm going to say good morning because it's morning where I am right now in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. It's 6 a.m. It's a balmy 18 degrees, but this is a heat wave for us because the last couple of days it's been about 0 or -5. But anyway, I want to welcome everybody to the IARS Virtual Education Webinars, an insider's guide to a successful IRS grant submission. My name is Julie Freed. I'm the moderator of this session, and I'm the current chair of the Scientific Advisory Board and of the study section that reviews the grants. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And of course, we have to just state that this program has not received any commercial support. Next slide. And just a couple of quick updates. If you did miss the amazing 2024 annual meeting, there are on-demand recordings available for our IARS members. And so if you just visit the webpage here, you can go on and check out those sessions. Next slide. But if you missed 2024, don't worry, because 2025 is right around the corner and it's in the beautiful Honolulu, Hawaii. It's going to be March 20th through the 23rd at the Hilton. I love it when the IRS is in Hawaii. It's going to be just amazing. So hope you can all attend. Next slide. Okay, and then of course, the IRS does participate with DocMatter. This is an online community where speakers are available for questions, comments, and we can continue this discussion there. In fact, the discussion was already started through DocMatter a couple days ago about this very important topic of how to submit successful grant applications. Next slide. And then, of course, there are some more upcoming webinars available. So there is the Women of Impact in Anesthesiology, Advancing in Leadership. That'll be April 8th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And then we also have the heparin and hamburgers. It's interesting. Perioperative implications of alpha-gal syndrome for the anesthesiologist. That's going to be May 13th, also at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Next slide. Okay. So this is how this is going to go. I'm going to go ahead and introduce, again, a little bit more about myself and the amazing 3 panelists we have here today. But as far as questions are concerned, we want you to ask questions. That's why we're here. And you can go ahead and use the Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar to submit your questions. So usually, it's kind of nice to hear from people and raise your hand, but it can get a little hectic on Zoom. So if you can put those questions in the chat, we would really appreciate it. And we'll get to your question as soon as possible. Next slide. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started with this amazing webinar about how to really put your best foot forward when it comes to submitting a grant application. So again, I'm your moderator today. I'm Julie Freed. I'm at the Medical College of Wisconsin, again, where it's nice and warm here and early. Again, I am chair of the Scientific Advisory Board in the study section. This will be 2025 will be my 3rd and final year in this role. I have served on this study section since, I don't know, 2018. I'm also a chartered member of an NIH study section. I've served on study sections for FAIR, for the American Heart Association. Let's just say I've reviewed a few grants. I have 3 amazing people with us today, and thank you so much to the 3 of you for agreeing to meet with us today. So I have Dr. Jessica Spence, who I'll be introducing in 1 second, or she'll introduce herself, Dr. John Whittle, he's in London, and Dr. Benjamin Steinberg in Canada. So I want to thank all 3 of you for being here. So again, just really quick about myself. I am a physician scientist, obviously. I'm a cardiac anesthesiologist here at MCW. I'm 20% clinical, 80% research. I run an NIH-funded lab in the cardiovascular center here, and I like to tell people that I spend 1 day a week taking care of patients in the operating room who are really at the end stage of cardiovascular disease, right? We're doing surgery and taking them off helicopters and putting them on devices. And then I spend the rest of the week studying how cardiovascular disease really begins in small blood vessels. And so with that, I would like the panelists to give just a little quick introduction, take 2 or 3 minutes to tell us who you are, where you are, what time of day is it, maybe the temperature, and a little bit about your research. So can we start first with Dr. John Whittle?
Oh, hi. Thanks very much for having me. Yes, I'm John Whittle, and I am we call them anaesthetist here, but an anesthesiologist in the UK, in London currently, we're trying to translate into Fahrenheit, it is 37 degrees, I think. Um, so yeah, so I am 50-50 academic, clinical. My clinical work is as an anesthesiologist and as an intensivist. I run a perioperative medicine program here, and my academic time is funded currently by our equivalent of the NIH, the NIHR, and very lucky to have that funding. So I run a lab that looks at mechanisms underlying the development of complications, mostly focused on aerobic fitness and metabolic flexibility. So thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Glad you're here. Okay. Dr. Jessica Spence, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm based in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is just outside of Toronto. Most of you will know Toronto. And I work here, similar to you, I work in the cardiovascular surgery ICU, and in the cardiac surgery ORs. So currently, in terms of my time, I do work as a clinician scientist. My time is split about 60 research, 40 clinical. And my research itself is focused on the perioperative outcomes of patients having cardiac surgery, focusing on neurocognitive and functional outcomes. In terms of the temperature, I'm really bad about Celsius to Fahrenheit conversions, but I think it's about 15.
Woo, yeah, it's chilly. Okay. And then finally, Dr. Benjamin Steinberg, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to participate here this morning too. My name is Ben Steinberg. I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Canada. Physician scientist. Other than taking care of kids in the operating room, I run a basic science lab here funded by the CIHR, which is, I guess, the NIH equivalent here in Canada. I'm a basic scientist, as I said, a cell biologist by training, and we study how sort of the terminal ends of the life of cells, so cell death, effectively contribute to inflammation and neuroinflammatory disorders, really from a fundamental perspective, with the aim of sort of devising new therapeutic strategies in terms of targeting these pathways. It's, I think, about 0 degrees, at least it was when I ran in. So this was clearly a race to the bottom. I don't know who won. May have all lost.
I think we're all no, we're all winners. We're all
Yeah,
winners.
I think
So
so too.
thank you for introducing yourself. So although it's chilly where a lot of us are right now, we're going to talk about this is a hot topic, right? How to be successful with your grant applications. And so again, everyone remind everybody, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, but I'm going to get some things rolling here. So I guess, after hearing all your introductions, I think it's safe to say you've all been very successful, right? It sounds like you've all reached that R-level equivalent funding at the NIH or at your institutions in your home countries. I want you guys first to just kind of briefly talk about a little bit about that first grant application you received. I'm assuming it's an IARS grant. It could be something else, but can you just touch on how important receiving that first grant is? Can we start with Dr. Whittle?
Yeah, I guess for me, historically, coming through training, doing research fellowships, doing a number of small grants to do small projects were kind of where you cut your teeth. But I think the transition towards independence is a huge step, and one that's quite difficult to make. So my award was the IARS Mentored Research Grant in 2019, which was probably the big opportunity to really step it up towards developing my own program of research and developing a lab. And I think, in fact, I was working in the US at the time. I was at Duke in North Carolina, and I had the unusual experience of both getting that grant immediately before a certain nasty little virus turned up the year after, and also before moving back to the UK, so splitting across two countries. And actually, it was honestly the only thing that really kept the academic side of my career motoring along. So it was of huge importance.
That's great. Dr. Spence, you want to comment on how important that first grant is to launch your scientific career?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess at the stage where I got it, I was leading, I had just just gotten my faculty position. And at the time I had gotten sort of CIHR with like NIH equivalent grants, but because I was a trainee at the time, you're not allowed to hold them as an independent investigator. So this was sort of my first official sort of independent grant. And there's no question that having the funds to actually get these projects moving was a big deal, and it made a huge difference as far as that I was able to leverage to get more funding to do more research.
Great. Dr. Steinberg, anything to add?
Well, I'd say similarly, it was the IARS's Mentored Award was my first real independent grant, and similarly, it kind of enabled my science to actually move forward. So, you come up with all these ideas, but you need sort of some protection to sort of push them forward. And this grant really allowed me to do that and get my science and my own program going. I think the only other thing I would really add is that this grant, at least for me, was really my first experience or exposure to what almost say like a real grant is, and sort of what it looks like to go through the process, and sort of gave me a sense for sort of what type of supports I need in terms of even writing a grant, many of which I still use today when I'm applying for funding to our, the CIHR, the equivalent of the NIH. So it really gave me a bit of perspective as well, and that's evolved somewhat. But it was a really sort of powerful experience from that perspective too.
What a perfect segue. So I will agree with you. I mean, getting that first grant is so exciting. And I'll never forget where I was standing. I was in Boston when I got the news of my first successful grant, and you feel like, wow, someone's going to give me money for my ideas. And it's a great moment. But it takes an awful lot of work and dedication to get there. And that's what I want to pivot to next, is talking about how to assemble a grant application and what are the key parts of it. And so one of the key things about, I think, when you're putting together a grant application is getting feedback from others, right? You want to reach out to other people to get that information. What do you think about this idea? And you want that feedback. I want you guys to touch on how do you go about that? When do you go about it in the process? And so, Dr. Steinberg, let's start with you. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is and how you get the feedback from others when you're assembling a grant application?
Sure. So at least for me, I mean, writing a grant is sort of an iterative process, but ultimately, I seek feedback quite early. The type of feedback is variable over the course or the evolution of the grant itself. But I think all of us could probably comfortably say, like, a lot of ideas. I think most of them are good. I think we should pursue them. But I mean, I vet these ideas with sort of my mentors and sort of colleagues on a routine basis. And I guess sort of maybe even unconsciously start to whittle down these ideas towards what I think sort of my research focus and program should be moving towards. That's both when I first started, that was really on a very broad level. Right. I mean, I really sort of needed help just even focusing what it is I want to do, because you're applying for almost like a project, not necessarily a program. And so early on, it was really getting guidance onto how you take sort of what I want my research career or 10 years, next 10 years to be, into what a true project over 3 to 5 years would look like. And so that started very early for me. And then once I sort of had a sense, I, start writing, and it's like any other sort of drafting a manuscript or otherwise, you need feedback on it on a reasonably regular basis. So I was getting feedback early, first on the idea, then on what the structure of my overall objective and specific aims were. And then it sort of, I went to go do some work. And then at the end, we actually have a nice program here. It's this sort of internal peer review program where all grants actually have to be, in a way, kind of vetted and reviewed by colleagues within our research institute. So, I mean, I probably would have done it anyway, but effectively 3 of my peers took my, final grant and went to town on it. And, with their feedback, you revise it, and then, eventually I was left with my submission. But I guess at each stage and with different people, I'm continuously seeking some feedback. The feedback focus sort of depends on with the stage of the grant application.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to get that feedback sometimes, isn't it? You know, you said somebody went to town on it.
Yeah.
I love that. But I will say this, I've had some colleagues come to me and say, you know, I have to submit this grant application, this R01. Would you mind looking at it? And I said, yeah, sure. Oh, it's due in a week. There's nothing I can tell you right now that's going to change anything, right? I can maybe say you missed a comma or a period here, but it's too late, right? You want to get that feedback early. Dr. Whittle, is there anything you want to add about how you go about getting feedback from your peers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that last comment is the most salient comment, is early. I'm thinking now, and I'm looking at my next grant is in April, and I'm already thinking, oh my God, it's pretty close, and we've already been to a couple of months of feedback, So I think, and it also depends strongly on the grant type that you're applying for, because of course there are, career development. Are they more personal development with a project? Are they, so the feedback is not just going to be about the content of the science that you're proposing, but it's also going to be about how you envisage structuring the other components that may be necessary parts of the grant around yourself, personal development, sort of courses, education, those sorts of things. And of course, actually, I probably would say more than half of the feedback I garner is actually from the people who administer these grants within my institution about, where the funds are going to go, how we're going to cost, whatever it is, personnel, research associates, lab time, those things, which actually, it's taken me quite a long time to get to understanding how important that bit is of the grant. I always just thought it was about the science, but actually that stuff really can make or break, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And so, in fact, I'm going to state for anybody who's listening, who's considering, submitting an application, and I hope you are, to the IRS or to whatever institution or agency, there's two very important questions that at least I look for when I'm reviewing an application or when I'm running a study section. And those two questions are, can it be done and should it be done, right? So we have to think about feasibility. Do you have the necessary expertise? Do you have the right people around you? Are the right person to do the study? And should it be done, the significance and impact. So I want to move to Dr. Spence. If there's something you want to talk about, feedback or any comments you want to make, go ahead and make it. But I also want to pivot a little more to, Dr. Whittle mentioned when you submit, especially an IRS mentored grant, right? This is a mentored grant. Can you also talk a little bit about how you went about creating the team, the structure, the training plan? It's because, like you said, it's not just about the science. When we review these applications, it's about the person, it's about who's around you, as well as the project. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm pretty lucky because I have an appointment at a research institute where there's a really broad array of expertise. And so in developing the grant idea, I kind of wanted to go out of my usual lane, in that I normally do clinical research and clinical trials. And so I was actually interested in doing more translational type research, where it was using an existing biobank to actually examine questions about outcomes in cardiac surgery. And I've never done lab research ever. And so clearly in that setting, I needed a mentor. I needed kind of a shared mentorship approach. And so in developing it, I met with my PhD supervisor at the time, who's a clinical trialist, and talked to him about leveraging some of the sort of medical biochemistry expertise within our institution. And so together we really sat and thought about, okay, so what are the skills that I have, and what are the skills that I need help in developing? And that was really the basis for framing the mentorship plan, with sort of it was a real co-mentorship approach to sort of address both of those areas. And then, not only thinking about, okay, so what is it that I'm going to develop, but specifically how, like, what is going to be the process to learning the things that I need to learn in order to do this sort of proteomic type research that is like completely new to me.
That's great. Yeah. And again, I want to stress that for these training grants, especially, it's true. You want to sell yourself. Okay, I'm a good, investment here. I have this kind of, experience. I have this expertise. However, my training isn't done yet. In order to be a successful physician scientist, I also need the training in this or something. We want to see that you're going to expand your skill set in your toolbox in some sort of way. So Dr. Steinberg, what would you say? I don't know if you remember about your training grant. Do you remember what you proposed as far as how to expand your training and your skill set?
Vaguely, yes. I think we even enacted some of it or most of it, hopefully. But I guess just to sort of start at the beginning before getting to the specifics there, the way kind of mentorship worked for me, I mean, often it's quite organic, sometimes it's sought, but kind of what was ingrained in me early was that mentorship, I'm a scientist, there's scientific mentorship. There's something to be said about learning around, scientific approaches and techniques. And then there's also career development mentorship. And so as I was progressing through, and this came out a little bit in my planning, is I had a clear mentor for the award that was primarily a scientific mentor, I would say, sort of an expert sort of in the field, not specifically invested in what I was doing, but certainly a content expert, a successful scientist who could sort of also show me what it looked like to run a lab and run projects. But I also had a very clear sort of career development mentorship plan as well. And they weren't necessarily my mentor actually has a large catchment, I guess you could say, but there were specific individuals who contributed to my career development mentorship plan, independent of the science itself. And I think that sort of came through in my plan that I proposed as well, because as an early career investigator who's pretty much fresh out of training, it was important to progress as a scientist, as a physician, but to marry those two together is not always trivial. And I needed help, I guess, or at least some guidance from the career perspective as well. And so I sort of had parallel paths that spoke to the scientific as well as the career professional growth. And that to me was an important piece of the mentorship plan.
That's great. And again, for everybody who's listening, if you have a question, go ahead and please put it in the chat. Right now, we're kind of focusing more on, I'd say, the mentoring part of the mentored grant. And so, Dr. Whittle, I'm going to move to you now. I mean, could you comment a little bit about the importance of the mentor, or better yet, the mentoring team that helped you get your first grant?
Yeah, right. I mean, clearly for a mentored research grant, this is kind of very central. So yeah, choosing a mentor can be a tricky one, can't it? It's just like when you choose your PhD supervisor. I think almost the same advice was given, is that you're going to live with this person for a while, and if you really want to get what you need out of it, you need to have the rules kind of set from the start as to how you're going to structure your interaction with that mentor, what exactly it is, because again, we're talking mentored research grant here, and as has already been said, a lot of that is about developing skills that you don't yet have to help you move on. And so that is going to be quite individual, but you have to be able to, number one, express it clearly, but also number two, the mentor needs to be able to express how they're going to support you to those goals. And again, in the application for the mentored research grant, there is the mentoring plan, and we set up exactly who the team were going to be, who the lead mentor was, what aspects of what the needs were, but also what the career objectives were and how we were going to meet those between the team and keep on track. And also what the environment is a thing, how that mentor will affect the environment. So again, if you've got a good mentor and a good environment that can support those things, that's important. So yeah, I think a reasonable amount of work went into just making sure that was aligned. The science bit was aligned with the career development, and that the environment suited all of those components. And where it didn't, where I was going to go to get those missing pieces.
Great. Okay, so maybe what we can do throughout this webinar too is I'm going to mention some things called fatal flaws. So that's something we refer to when we're reviewing grant applications where, there are key pieces of the application we need to see. And if we don't see them, we consider that a fatal flaw, and your application is now just significantly dropped near the bottom of the pile. And I would think a fatal flaw for a mentored research grant is, let's talk about the fatal flaws for mentorship. One is when you have a mentor that really has no successful track record of funding. So for everybody who's listening, we're always looking for people who have mentors who do have that track record, because after all, if they don't have that, then how do we expect them to teach you how to go ahead and be a successful independent scientist? So track record for the mentor is very important. If they don't have that, I do consider that, and a lot of people do consider that, a fatal flaw. Another one, though, is you might have the most outstanding mentor on paper, and they have a long history of successful grant funding, but we go to read your application and we can tell maybe you didn't get the help that you needed. And that could be for one reason or another. Maybe your mentor is so busy that they're not giving you the amount of time that you need, or you didn't seek out their assistance. But that is also a red flag or a fatal flaw when we see that, okay, this person has an outstanding mentor. They have all this, track record of funding, but then we read the application and it falls flat somehow. And it makes us question whether you really have that strong mentoring relationship with that person. So just some things to think about. Speaking of fatal flaws, do you guys have any other thoughts about fatal flaws regarding the training plan or the mentoring aspect of it? Fatal flaws. Dr.
I might add overcommitment. Or lack of availability for mentor. So it is sort of a big fatal flaw, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I agree with that. Okay, so now we can pivot a little bit. So again, mentor training grants, very important to have that mentor, better yet, mentoring team. I usually don't like to go over 3 people. You don't want to have a mentoring team of 8 or so, then you're gonna be confused. But a mentoring team is always nice to have. The training plan is very important. We talked about what other skill sets are you going to receive. So again, it's not just the science for these applications. It's who you are, the applicant, the mentoring team, the training plan, and then of course the science. So let's pivot a little bit more to the science part of the application. And I was wondering, well, first of all, I guess I'm going to ask you guys, the panelists, a question. Is there something you wish you would have known, or something you know now that you wish you would have known when you were assembling your first grant application? In other words, what kind of wisdom have you gained over the years now that you've gone on to receive other grant applications? Is there something that you wish you would have known then that you know now? And can we start with Dr. Steinberg?
Stuff. I think it's maybe not so much about even the organization. It's actually just the time that goes into putting these together. I take probably about 6 months to put an application together. I can do it a little bit more quickly, but not to say I was specifically rushed with this one, but the fact of the matter was I was coming pretty much straight out of a fellowship, which was quite demanding from just a clinical time perspective. And even though I thought I had the foresight to, start early, speak to people, get support, get advice, you can put something together pretty quickly, but the refinement takes quite a bit of time, especially if you are seeking feedback. I guess I'm kind of going back to what was said before, but you can't change your grant in a week. For me, I need at least 4. I think some scientists around me will say 3 is sufficient, but they're also in the lab or what have you every day of the week. So I need a little bit of extra time. So it's sort of about figuring out what your pace is. And I think early on, I hadn't quite established that. And you may have to just figure it out empirically, but you need to sort of set yourself up for success. And for me, it was just, I probably should have paid a bit more attention to how long it takes.
That's great advice. Okay, Dr. Spence.
I think building on that, just recognizing that there are a lot of elements of the grant that you can't possibly figure out by yourself. And so when you factor in time, you have to factor in other people's time as well. And that relates to things like budgeting and understanding what resources are available and costing things. For example, talking to suppliers and costing out equipment and that sort of thing. I think the other thing that, I wish I had known, but at the same time, I'm not sure I could have known, is just that, you know, when you budget for things, the costing that you set out up front can be dramatically impacted by things like pandemics and supply chains and whatnot. So I would say when you are costing things, it's probably in your best interest to be conservative in your cost estimates.
That's great advice. Dr. Whittle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that lots of us who engage in science are quite enthusiastic people, and creative and want to solve big problems. And I think that can be a problem, especially when you're setting out as being overambitious. And I've certainly been dinged on that in grants in the past. Proposing too much in a study, not being sure that it is feasible within the proposed timeline or budget, or if you think it is, you really have to be able to demonstrate how. And that does then reflect back on exactly, your specific aims and your hypotheses have to be tight and within the scope of the grant. So yeah, I think not to say don't be ambitious, but maybe you can go too far the other side.
Oh, and you brought up another fatal flaw. Fantastic. So Dr. Whittle brought up the topic of being overly ambitious. So this is the IARS Mentored Research Grant is a 2-year award. And, occasionally we'll run into applications where they have just grand ideas or really good ideas. But then we go to read the research plan and we figure out that they're proposing to do 600 or 700 animals, or we're talking about grand scale projects that would probably take 5 or 6 years if, they go well. And we're talking about a 2-year award. And so thank you for bringing that up, because I do consider that another fatal flaw. We do talk about, again, getting back to those 2 questions, can it be done? Should it be done? Can it be done? What you're proposing, can it reasonably be done in the time span of the grant award? And that is something we do take into consideration. Sometimes there's exceptions where some people will propose something a little more grand, and we look at the mentor. That's when we go to the mentor and say, okay, but the mentor has done this before. They have a good track record, and if anybody's capable of doing it, maybe it's this person at this institution, and so we can bend a little bit. But you have to make sure that what you're proposing can actually be done within the 2-year time frame. So I don't know if you guys have anything else you want to comment on that before I move on. No? Okay. Dr. Whittle looked like he was going to say something, but maybe not. Okay, so we're going to pivot a little bit now to, you've submitted your grant application. I'm sure, again, you're all successful researchers, but I don't know, maybe occasionally you've received some feedback on a grant application that wasn't favorable. I can talk about that all day, right? But the more applications we submit, you're also going to have more opportunities to maybe not have your grant discussed, which means it's triaged, and we can talk about that a little bit more, or it doesn't get funded on the first try. And so I guess I'd like to pivot more about now, how do we overcome that, right? Because it, as much as I always tell myself, don't take it personally, I always take it personally. In fact, I go through the 5 stages of grief after I receive a poor grant score or find out something wasn't discussed, right? And it happens to all of us. Don't be fooled. The most successful people out there submit plenty of grant applications that don't get discussed or receive poor scores. But I want to pivot now to talk about, how do you deal with that? You can get personal. You can tell me, is there something you do, or who you talk to, or how do you get over that, or do you just brush it off? And then I also want to talk about now, what's the next step after that? In other words, you get that information, and what do you do with it, and how do you resubmit? So let's start with Dr. Spence. Can you talk to us about, okay, maybe you've received not so good news. How do you even go about dealing with that?
I mean, I guess the first thing is get used to it, because if you're going to be a clinician scientist, more grants that you submit are not going to get funded than get funded. That's just the reality of it. And so you have to be pretty thick-skinned when it comes to this sort of thing. And you have to recognize that in order to do this, you really have to pound the pavement and constantly beg people for money. The other thing that I do is I try to, firstly, because most of the time, your first reaction is oh, these reviewers are stupid. They don't understand my research. It's like you said, the 5 stages of grief. You just have to set it aside and let it go for until it's no longer such an emotional hot potato. And then you look objectively at the feedback and you try and figure out what is it that was missing from your grant that's reflecting the reviewer's feedback that you need to incorporate for the next round. And most of the time, the reality is that with grant submissions, when there is an opportunity to resubmit, oftentimes if you can address, if there's no fatal flaws and you can address the reviewer's concerns, it's not uncommon that you go on to get funded in later rounds of that same grant application. I think more often than not, one thing that I've encountered is that it's really easy to get caught up in the science or the clinical context if it's something that you do. But it's really important that when you're writing a grant, to remember that the people who are reading it are likely very educated, but they don't have the same content expertise that you have. And so you always have to help think about the narrative and help walk people through the narrative that underlies your grant application and take them through the steps that I think many of us tend to gloss over just because we're already, we are already enmeshed in this area of research. And I think that's usually because more often than not, when things are triaged or not funded, it's just because people just don't get the idea. And so it's taking a step back and trying to simplify the narrative so that it's a little bit more clear what it is that you're trying to propose.
Great. And I think you made an excellent point there, is being clear. And no matter how many times, I think I'm writing the most clear application, you can get that comment back and you're reading the critiques and going, they just don't get it. But then you have to turn inward and saying, nope, maybe I'm not explaining myself thoroughly. Dr. Steinberg, what do you do with those reviewer comments? Do you burn them or do you address them? What do you do?
Actually, perhaps like yourself, I put them aside for a moment. The result is the result. I put it aside, I'll commiserate for a day or two with somebody else. And then at one point, I think it's actually quite worthwhile to go back to the reviewer comments, because at least for us, for most of the applications I submit, at least I should say right now, even if I'm triaged, I get a reason as to why it was triaged, and I get some feedback regardless of discussion. And, it's fine. It's at my discretion to decide which of those comments I want to act on or not. But there's usually something really important to glean from it, if not something specific and concrete to change. And I think the next maneuver after actually having read them and try to be thoughtful around them is to decide whether there is opportunity for me to resubmit. Or is this sort of really, at the stage of maybe it needs a proper rewrite, and I'm not going to resubmit exactly the next time. Maybe I have to skip one, round or competition and try again. But I can't say I've ever received feedback, no matter how negative, that hasn't been to some extent constructive. And I think it sort of behooves you put so much effort into it. It's a shame to kind of just put it aside and say, never again. You do need thick skin. You got to get back up, and it sort of depends on you as to how quickly. But I think there's something to you can win something from even the most negative review.
I completely agree. No matter how hard it is to read those comments, I want to quickly, because I'm not seeing a lot of questions in the chat. I'm sure it's just because you're enthralled by what we're saying. But I want to make sure if there are people listening and they're like, what is triage? Like, what are they even talking about? I want to remind everybody that when we receive a pile of applications to review, those applications are sent out to a minimum of 3 reviewers. Those 3 reviewers spend the time reviewing the application. They score sections based on significance and innovation, the research plan, again, the trainee, the mentor training plan. We end up with all these scores. Those scores get compiled, and then an impact score is created. And the impact score is saying, okay, grand overall picture, how important is this application going to be for the field? And that final score, those 3 final scores get averaged. We then bring all those scores together, and we only end up discussing in the study section the top half of those scores. And so unfortunately, the bottom half of the applications don't go on to get discussed. And so instead of receiving comments based on what we talked about in the study section, unfortunately, you get a triaged application or something that wasn't discussed. So that's what we're talking about here. So Dr. Whittle, anything you want to talk about as far as what to do with those reviewer comments that come in or an unsuccessful grant application?
Yeah, I mean, I think, agree with everything that's been said so far. I guess, yeah, perspective is one thing, because rejection's common, and it doesn't reflect your worth, I guess. Try and filter out the critiques. So, there will be some less useful critique, but there'll also be some useful. So anything actionable, and patterns as well, because sometimes you submit the same grant to different funding bodies, and because the first time you go, wow, they were clearly had no idea. I'll submit it somewhere else. And then actually the pattern is exactly the same. You're like, okay. Also, most of the time, the criticisms aren't personal. It's about improving the science, not about discouraging you, even though you feel discouraged when you get a rejection. You can, if it's big, certainly in the UK, you can, with some of the bigger grants, bigger program grants, talk with program officers or request a callback. Those are like your trump cards, so please use them sparingly. But they can sometimes be very helpful in helping you understand who and what reviewers are looking for, what the funding organization is looking for, and whether you really do align with the call. And I call that considering the fit. So does it align well with the goals of the agency? Because it may be that you've done a beautiful application, but it just doesn't align, and it was never going to get funded. So I think that's probably my main observations.
Great. And then once again, okay, you guys are just bringing up excellent points. What to do when you get those comments. And so Dr. Whittle mentioned, and of course we do this for a lot of agencies, is that after you get the results and you're maybe disappointed, you can reach out. And so for here in the US, if you have an NIH application, you reach out to a program officer, or like with these other agencies. And with the IARS, I want to ensure everybody that, we make sure that the comments that you receive are respectful, right? They shouldn't be they shouldn't be, too harsh. They're meant to be helpful. But afterwards, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us, to Trisha Brazil. She'll put you in contact with me, and I have no problem discussing with you kind of, what the main issues were and give you some help and suggestions on how to move forward. So with that, I also want to mention another fatal flaw, which is now you've received these comments and you're going to resubmit. Okay, so you had your moment of grief, you've gotten over it, you're going to, now attack all those comments and you want to resubmit. But if you do put in a resubmission, the review panel will look to see how responsive you were to those critiques. And so a fatal flaw then the second time around is, although you received that feedback, did you actually incorporate it? And that is something that, again, we highly consider. And so I will ask the reviewers, do you think they were responsive to prior critiques? And they have to answer, yes or no, or maybe so. The problem is sometimes you receive so many comments, right? And I was hoping that the panelists here could kind of also comment on, okay, now you have this pile of critiques and comments that you have to address. Do you respond to every single comment, or how do you go about picking and choosing which ones you want to respond to? And I'll start with Dr. Whittle.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, that one. You get this with papers as well, right? I just had one submitted accepted after a year where there were 15 reviewers, and I can tell you now, and they didn't agree with each other about the paper. So there's a little bit of, this is where you yourself will self-reflect, but also where you need to reach out to your peers and mentors a little bit as well, to try and understand, what is and what isn't reasonable, because it can be hard to filter that. And some of this is about, we talked about the fatal flaws, but some of this is about just coherence in what you're trying to submit and the messaging. So the reason sometimes that there may be the reasons that there may be opposing opinions on your grant will be one of them is that just you haven't been able to communicate quite as well as you'd like to exactly why the proposed program of research is the right one. And then sometimes it will just be because some reviewers just don't agree with each other anyway, because that's science. And that's a little bit harder to deal with. So you need to kind of go for normally it's not just one person who says yes, no to your grant. There's team of reviewers, there's lead reviewers, etc. And really you've just got to convince that it gets over the line and that it's not fatal. You're scientifically fatal we're talking about now. The problem that the reviewers have with it. So yeah, it unfortunately is more common than you think, but you can overcome it.
That's great. Dr. Steinberg, how do you address all these comments?
Yeah, so I guess it sort of sometimes context specific. So I guess in very broad strokes, one of the first decisions I sort of have to make is, am I resubmitting this grant? And if so, when? Because, some of the suggestions may be fabulous, but from just a time perspective or feasibility perspective, it depends on what the cycling is. If you have another year to make these changes, that's great. That's usually a reasonable amount of time to get some work done. Sometimes you have a lot less time, at which point you sort of have to, if you plan on resubmitting, you have to somehow acknowledge that this is a great idea, but between January and April, just simply not possible. So in those circumstances, if I still feel that the grant is strong enough, I don't ignore those comments or suggestions. In fact, I often, if I really think they're good ones, acknowledge them as good suggestions and sort of somehow in my response to the reviewers have to address it in some form. And in some instances, even though I might not be able to do the ideal experiment or provide exactly what was requested, which I would love to be able to do, I come up with some contingency. So I kind of vet the comments. I go over them with either a mentor or a co-applicant in some cases and sort of decide what, if it's not stated explicitly, what are the key criteria by which we did not get this grant, and then try to come through with a plan to address those one way or another. And sometimes it's just an acknowledgement because, to be honest, I just couldn't get there in this time period. And that's not to say I won't work on it in the background. I just know that it won't see, the light of day in the new grant. But I try to address as much of them as possible, especially those that I think are really key.
Great, thanks. Dr. Spence, I'm going to move to you, but we actually do have some questions in the chat. Now that I figured out where the questions popped up, I was looking in the wrong spot. The good news is some of the questions that have been asked, we've already addressed. Someone did ask, how early do you want to get feedback? We've talked about that. Obviously, the answer is as early as possible. We have somebody asking, how much do you have to have accomplished, at least data-wise? And by data-wise, I'm assuming, productivity, maybe papers, before writing a training grant to be successful. And so, Dr. Spence, and I can comment on it as well, but can anybody write a training grant, or do you have to have so much, productivity done in your career so far before you were to go for this grant?
I mean, to be honest, not having sat on the review committee, I'm not sure, but I would say, having sat on a number of other grant review committees, you have to be convinced, even for a training grant, that the person at least has the building blocks to do what it is that they need to do. And so it kind of depends on the project itself, but I think that somebody has to have a track record of at least demonstrating sort of interest and enthusiasm for research. I struggle to imagine that somebody would get this not having done any research ever at all. So, I think somebody has to have at least demonstrated an interest in research, and I think have in themselves the essential basics that are required for doing the training. So if it's a project that's really statistically heavy, then they at least have background in basic statistics. And there's some way that the lack of formal statistical training is addressed in the mentor plan. But I think probably, I suspect probably you can answer that a little bit better about how much groundwork somebody has to have done.
Yeah, and then I do agree with you. So yes, I agree with Dr. Spence. You don't want to say, well, I've never done research before. I think I'm going to go for this research training grant. We're trying to get away, everyone's trying to get away from saying, well, so-and-so's got this many publications, this many first author, this many last author. We're really trying to get away from that. It's really about, do you have the expertise? And well, how do you prove that you have expertise in a certain area? You publish in it, right? And it's not so much the volume, the number of publications, right? Because we could say, well, so-and-so's got 10 publications. Well, great. What if 9 of those are case reports and only 1 is an original manuscript? So we're trying to get away from that and looking really more at, have they published in the field? Do they have some experience? So yes, we do want to see that. So it's not really about how much do you have data-wise or how much have you produced, but do you have the expertise to do what you are proposing to do? I also want to comment really quick on the review process a little bit to give you kind of an insider's look on how the study section works, because again, we were talking about responding to reviewers. And unfortunately, sometimes you will get critiques back and you look at these individual scores from the reviewers and they're kind of divergent. You might have a situation where 2 out of the 3 reviewers just absolutely loved your application, but this one tough reviewer seems to not like it as much and gave it more of a poor score. I want to remind everybody with the scores that, we do use the NIH scale, where 1 is the best application we've ever read. And if there are any tiny errors, it doesn't matter. And 9, of course, is we've got nothing but fatal flaws. An average score is actually about a 4 or 5 in the middle, and then we kind of tend to go up and down from there. So it's my job as chair of the study section to, when I do have divergent reviewers, it's my job to try to bring people together and get to what we call consensus. It doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes the discussions are, I'd say, a little rough, as far as, people have differing opinions. Sometimes we discuss applications rather quickly if everybody's on the same page, thinking it's all maybe higher scores versus lower scores. But occasionally we do run into that. And we do try to, again, at least try to come to a consensus, but it doesn't always happen. So just wanted to give you a little heads up on that. I do see another question coming in. I have a question. Can someone clarify, you are applying for a mentored grant, but you are coming from a training grant? I'm not quite sure how to answer that one. If you're applying for a mentored grant coming from a training grant, there are training grants. I don't know if this is what this person is talking about. Training grants come in all shapes and sizes. You could have an institutional training grant. I'll just talk about what I know about in the States, right? We have KL2s, we have T32s, T35s. Those are training grants that you can be a part of where you have a mentor. But then yes, from those grants, you are eligible to apply for a mentored training award. And that could be, again, the IARS mentored training grant. So a good question. Okay, I'm kind of looking at the time. We only have about 7 minutes left. So I was hoping to pivot just maybe one more time and talk about, again, a couple more fatal flaws, because after all, this is what we want people to know about. It's kind of what to do and what not to do. And I guess I'm just going to open it up. When you guys are looking at, let's say you're looking at someone's grant application or even your own, we should be our own worst, we should be able to critique our work. Do you guys have any other, thoughts about fatal flaws? Something you see in a grant application, whether it's yours or someone else's, and you go, okay, no, this isn't good. This is not going to work. I'll stick with Dr. Spence for now. Any thoughts on any more fatal flaws?
I think for the most part, I think it depends on, one of the things that I find is that there's a grant that in and of itself, it's most of the time at this level for training level grants, this isn't going to be like curing cancer. It's not going to be massively impactful, but most of the time the work that these fund can actually provide the basis for larger scale work. And so I think in my mind, if there's not sort of a pathway forward from this work, I often find that to be a fatal flaw. Like if it's just sort of, say, for example, somebody proposes a large, observational, registry-based study that's going to generate hypotheses. At the end of it, though, what's the next step? Like, how are you going to actually take this information and move it forward so you can actually impact on medicine or anesthesia?
That's great. And what you're talking about is advancing the field, and that's where
Right.
impact comes in. I do have a question in the chat, which is, can a fatal flaw really be anticipated? I would say yes, right? We should be able to look at our applications. I will say, I'll throw out a couple fatal flaws that I've seen in grant applications. One is your aims are dependent on one another. That's a fatal flaw, right? If you propose two aims, but aim 2 is not going to work unless aim 1 is completely successful, that's a fatal flaw. That's going to be a problem. If you don't have simple things that we require of you, human protections, authentication of reagents and resources, if you don't have a robust statistical plan, if you don't have a power analysis, these are fatal flaws. And it's very easy for a reviewer to see those fatal flaws and go, well, that's it. It's automatically going to get a poor score. It's going to go to the bottom of the pile. These are things you can anticipate and you can do something about. Dr. Steinberg, any other fatal flaws you think you are worth mentioning?
I guess it also harks back a little bit to sort of the question around data and expertise. I think, you have a good idea, but you also have to not only promote your idea as to why it's significant and impactful, but you also have to show that you can do it. So the one that I still struggle with to this day is to sort of ensure and convince a feasibility to my studies. I will just say, just from a data perspective, that's where preliminary data, should you have it, can be really useful because it can show rationale to the science. It can also show feasibility with respect to methodology and a burgeoning expertise in a space. So I think as I think through my own grants, I just want to make sure that my ideas have not gotten ahead of my capacity. And so just feasibility is something that you, at least on a secondary level, you need to always consider in your proposal, because if people don't think you can do it, they may love the idea and concept, but they're not going to provide you with the funds.
Exactly. Can it be done? Should it be done? Dr. Whittle, any final fatal flaws you can think of?
No, I mean, there's loads. I think 15. No. So I think, yeah, at the basis, I'm going to go unclear hypothesis or objectives, not innovative. Really, if you're just reiterating existing knowledge, it's not going to be that exciting. Yeah, you've talked about specific aims. We talked about overambitious. Failure to address risks and limitations. We haven't really talked about that, but if you don't try and anticipate that there may be challenges, it may make it feel more unrealistic. Talked about budget. No, I think that's probably most of it. Maybe where you're asking for team members, you really need to be able to justify, because sometimes a grant can feel like your review can just feel like a way to improve the person's team as opposed to support the specific project. So I think if you're asking for personnel or whatever within a grant, then be careful about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And thank you for bringing up another fatal flaw. If you don't address potential pitfalls, what could go wrong? And you've thought about it. We want to see that you've thought about anything that could go wrong, not everything, but major things that could go wrong. And if they do go wrong, what's your alternative solution? How are you going to pivot? What are you going to do? We want to see that as well. We are close to being out of time. We have about maybe a minute left. There is one last question I want to address in the chat, which is, just about the time limit for the IARS mentored grant. What is considered an early career researcher? We have the same discussion in the study section. And again, for the IARS mentored training grant, Trisha's going to yell at me if I get this wrong, but I believe it's 10 years. So you need to be within 10 years of, ending your training. And then what's hard is that could be a gray area depending on when you finished your fellowship or when you finished another terminal degree. But if you have a question about that, you just reach out to the IARS and we can get an answer back to you. So if you ever have any questions about eligibility, just reach out and we can answer those questions. So with that, we're at the top of the hour here, and that's going to complete this webinar. Kristen Howard has just put, she's putting some websites in the chat if you want to look and get that information. Thank you for joining us today. I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Whittle, Dr. Steinberg, Dr. Spence, for being here and taking your time and sharing your words of wisdom with everybody. And with that, I just want to wish everybody successful grant applications and good luck to all. And thanks for coming. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.